individual, education, and plan, and all three words are important. I'll start with the third word, and that is plan. And we're planning for change. The status quo is not good enough. Improvement is necessary. And of course, hope is involved, because all of our children are worth every ounce of hope that we can give to them. The change involves advocacy about reducing the vulnerability and amplifying the voices of students. In the first webinar of this series, Susan Biani talked about the importance of a family vision, about aiming higher for her daughter Rebecca, and told about the contributions Rebecca has made through her connections. Susan Biani talked about avoiding dangerous assumptions, and those are assumptions that both parents and teachers can make. And education must always involve career development. That's what it's all about. So moving on to the next word. Okay, so the third word was plan, the second word is education, and the webinar, first webinar in this series featured Sheila Bennett also talking about putting research into practice and some analysis of research that's been done that shows that there is research evidence. There is the supporting inclusion. There is really not research evidence supporting continuing the old practice of segregation. Sheila also mentioned an analysis of StatsCan information that was done by Vianne Timmons and Marianne Wagner. So you've got the links here. Don't worry about writing them down because you can go back to this. I've also found a couple of other sources that summarize some research information, one coming from the United States, University of Kansas, and another coming from Queen's University, where some researchers there actually found that there were not positive public attitudes about the inclusion of students with disabilities, in spite of the fact that there was very clear evidence that education was better for all students in regular class together. So those are two more studies that are worth looking at just to back up our word education. And again, who would we ask? What the people with the experience. So the Integration Action for Inclusion organization in Ontario was funded by the Ministry of Education and completed a report 2 years ago, having done qualitative research with 2 high schools in Ontario. And I recommend that you read that report. I was closely involved with the research, and I was totally inspired by the things that the teachers said about why it's important to them to do a better job for students of all abilities, and why they teach better when there are students of all abilities in their classes, and also the kinds of resources that they think would help them. Another source of expertise about education and the outcomes is from People First groups, people with disabilities themselves, who have often experienced segregation, including institutionalization. And they have always talked about real work, real pay, real home, and that the way to achieve those outcomes in life is through real education, a real school. And that is the school you would attend if you didn't have a disability, with whatever support you need. So the first word is individual, and really want to talk about the uniqueness. So unique is an important word, but I think learner is an important word. It somehow takes us a little bit beyond pupil or student or child or son or daughter or student. I think learner is a very positive word. And what we're up against, that rock and a hard place that we're up against, because IEPs came from an old structure and an old value base, is that IEPs that I see that families and schools share with me are not building on the uniqueness of the student. We're missing that individual, and therefore we're not getting the right support to the teacher or to the student in the classroom. Most school boards in Ontario use some kind of a computer-generated IEP engine, and some of those have been programmed based on very old stereotypes about each category of disability and exceptionality. And therefore they reproduce those stereotypes. And you can sometimes tell if the IEP you're looking at is not about uniqueness, that there'll be statements like the student or his or her, sometimes even the wrong name. I looked at an IEP once with a student who said to me, "My name's Dustin," and this IEP all through it says David. He was able to read that and find the problem. And really those kind of what happens if IEPs are built around stereotypes based on the exceptionality category is that all the IEPs for the students with the same label end up looking alike. And that's especially problematic. It can be dangerous because if students with the same label all have the same or similar IEPs, the school system will expect them to be together, to have their needs met in the same place. And that is usually apart from everyone else in a segregated setting. So it reproduces what's negative about labels. People with disabilities have said, label jars, not people, because the label tells you what's inside a jar or a can. A label sometimes prevents you from getting to know the student. And it used to be that IEP engines, or it used to be that school systems received funding from the province based on individual descriptions of students. That system stopped in 2004. But many of the school boards had programmed their IEP computer system to churn out the phrases which were required in IEPs and were checked by government people and in order to get the funding. So those phrases were often really very demeaning. It was known as, it was called the intensive support amount, and some people called it I'll say anything. Or diagnosis for dollars. So that's really problematic if the IEP does that. And that can reproduce some very dangerous assumptions about the things students can't do. There is no longer an incentive to describe students negatively in order to get money. Money doesn't come to boards according to that kind of a negative system, because advocacy organizations like Community Living Ontario fought it and were able to stop it. But still on the word individual, the Education Act defines all its terms in the beginning of the document. And special education program is defined right at the beginning of the Ontario Education Act as having to do with one student at a time. It's in the singular, an exceptional pupil or the exceptional pupil. There's nothing in this definition of special education program about groupings. This means that whenever the word program is used in an IEP or in any kind of conversation, whenever anyone's talking about special education program, we should hold them to this definition and reinforce the notion that program means designing for one student at a time, not groups of students. And it means that the support should come to students right where they belong, in regular classrooms in their own neighborhood schools. The law supports that, individualizing. The Education Act Regulation 181 came into effect in 1998. And that was the first time that IEPs were required for all exceptional students. It happens, though, that they are provided for thousands of students who have not been identified exceptional in Ontario. So it is not necessary to have an Identification Placement Review Committee, IPRC, decision that a student is officially exceptional. They are done for many other students. and certainly are a key way to support students in regular classrooms. The law uses the term consult with. Schools are required to consult with parents and older students over 14 and over. It's important also the words to be received. An IEP outlines special education programs and services to be received by the pupil, and that's been defined by a lawyer in general terms as meaning that an IEP is a legally enforceable promise. An IEP must be completed within 30 school days after the start of placement, and that is usually the first day of school in September. It must also be completed within 30 school days of the start of the second semester for high school students. An IEP must involve a section called a transition plan. We'll talk about that a bit later, for students who have disabilities and they're aged 14 and over. The school principal is legally responsible that all these conditions be met with the IEP. And it's important to think about how we support students to learn as members of the regular classroom, how an IEP does that, because there is a link between, if a student has been identified, a link between when that identification and placement is reviewed every year, potentially. An IPRC looks at students' needs and whether they can be met in regular class. An IEP is a document that determines how those needs are met in regular class. So it needs to do a good job of meeting needs in regular class in order to make sure that there isn't a threat to the student's placement in regular class. Another piece of the law is that an IEP is considered to be an accommodation plan under the Ontario Human Rights Code. And the Human Rights Code is more important than any other legislation. It overrules the Education Act where necessary. I'm mentioning the law. I don't mean that people should think that defending or promoting better IEPs involves legal action, but it does mean knowing how the law encourages the right thing to happen and how the law could help if you needed it to help. It's a tool that's available to you. In 2004, the Ontario Human Rights Commission wrote Guidelines on Accessible Education, which clarify what the law would say if you did go to court, if you did have a human rights legal action. And that before considering segregation, education providers must first make efforts to build or adapt educational services to accommodate students with disabilities and promote their full participation and inclusion. A couple of years ago, the Human Rights Commission Chief Commissioner Barbara Hall said, "Inclusion is the goal of accommodation." In other words, we could say tonight, inclusion is the goal of IEPs. And to not include puts schools in conflict with the law.